We're joined by Richard Slotkin, a cultural critic, historian, and professor of English and American Studies at Wesleyan University, as well as author of recent book, A Great Disorder, National Myth, and the Battle for America. I want to start by saying thank you so much for loaning us some of your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I want to start with, I guess, the crux of what the book is about in a national myth. I feel like it's a very particular phrasing for a reason. Could you kind of explain what this means and why they exist today?
Yeah, well, the formation of nation states, uh, it's not they're kind of innovations in the way that things are structured, and the political classes that created the nation states, the modern ones, tried to root their construction in something deeper than just the politics of the moment. So they made up stories, usually based on some kind of fact, to explain that the people of different ethnic, religious, linguistic groups who now form the nation have some kind of common ancestry. So the French can look back to Charlemagne and Joan of Arc. The United States, it's a particularly critical structure because it's an artificial country in every way. It's a settler state formed by European settlers from various nationalities, ethnic groups, what we would call races. So you need some kind of historical fable to give you a sense that you all come from the same place, you all start with the same premises, and you're all moving in the same direction. So every national myth takes off from a crisis that really touches on something basic about the country and develops a script. How did our ancestors deal with the crisis? And is this a model for us today?
So yeah, so that sounds pretty well summed up. One of my questions, and I do want to get into it, I guess, more later in the interview, but to what extent, I guess, if at all, can these myths kind of serve as a way for our government to kind of mythologize past actions to justify more so things they're going to do or things that are happening now even?
Okay, the thing about the myth is that the stories that constitute a mythology are out there. They're in the culture. Anyone can use them. Governments make very particular, focused, highly focused use of the models. And the best example that I can give of that is what I call the good war myth coming out of World War II, a diverse nation uniting to defeat a common enemy. And it begins with the moral that if you appease a dictator, you're ultimately going to have to fight a war. So, okay, September 11th happens, and Bush says, it's Pearl Harbor. Now you know what movie you're in. Now you know what story you're in. If this is Pearl Harbor, we don't deal with diplomacy. We don't deal with the CIA assassinating people on the sly. We go to war if that's the script. And that's how it works. That you have a model that you can invoke, and everybody knows what you mean by it. Now, not everybody's going to enlist in the cause, but everybody at least understands what it is you're trying to say and what the choices before them are.
So yeah, I'm glad that you brought up one of the myths. I know there's like the four big ones you discuss in the book and whatnot, and obviously I wanted to ask you about and get into those. Could you kind of start with the myth of the frontier, going into what this
Yeah.
is and kind of why it was started?
Okay, sure. Okay, the myth of the frontier is the oldest American myth because it says that our origin point is as a settlement of European settlers in a wilderness environment, and that settlement grew to be a mighty nation through the process of conquering the wilderness and conquering the indigenous people of the wilderness, the tremendously rich natural resources that the wilderness contains, so that America doesn't just grow by the sweat of our brow and even by the sweat of other people's brow. We have a bonanza. We hit a bonanza. We have a gold rush. everybody can get fabulously wealthy from a gold rush. But even at the very beginning, all that land available for settlement in an agricultural world, that's a bonanza right there. And so that the myth of the frontier says that America becomes what it is, an individualistic democracy, capitalist society, fabulously wealthy through the discovery and exploitation of natural resources, what I call bonanza economics, and savage war. There's a racial component. One of the ways that the American defines himself at the beginning, from the very beginning, is I am not an indigenous non-white person. And that's fundamental. And so from the very beginning, the language of progress is there, a certain magical kind of capitalism, but also the notion of race and racial exclusion. And that plays right through as the economy changes. When you go from land to mineral resources, that's what it is. And you get to the 20th century, it's oil. That's the big bonanza that makes everything go. And we're still dealing with that.
Yes.
I don't know if you know, but the Koch brothers used to have a website in which they describe oil as freedom fuel.
Oh, wow.
I mean, you know, okay, so there's your myth right there.
Yeah, and one of the things I notice, I guess not just with this myth in particular, but with it as well, but like a lot of the telling of American history in general, it's kind of very much from the settler point of view.
Yes.
And in some ways, this can kind of like just diminish or whitewash or do away with kind of the experience of the indigenous people. Is this something that you would agree with as well, and how these myths can be applied?
Yes, I agree. That is, if you take what I'll call like the dominant form or the traditional form of the myth, yeah, it's a settler's story. And if you look at the history of United States history textbooks, it's the history of settlement. It's the history of the settlers. Even if it's sympathetic to the indigenous peoples, it's a settler's story. And the rationale for that, it's not a crazy rationale, is the state was formed by the settlers. And so it's one of the stories you have to tell to understand why we are where we are, which is to say a conflict of some kind. And I spoke about indigenous versus settler. The notion of an indigenous world and of an indigenous set of values is carried in the myth. In its original traditional form, it's enemy ideology.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there as a possibility for, gee, we could have done something differently. Look at what we lost by doing it the way we did it. So you get from the very beginning this notion of recovering something of the indigenous. And that's a wedge that opens the language, makes the myth potentially useful against the settler ideology. I don't want to oversimplify and say that, oh, just do it. I just want to say that it's in the culture. It's there. It's available.
Definitely, it works as like maybe like an introduction, at least, so to speak, of indigenous culture and
Yes,
things.
that's right.
So in kind of the same way, could you go into the myth of the founding? I know that's another one of the big four ones that
Yeah.
you discussed.
Okay. So the myth of the founding is the United States was formed by a generation of brilliant and highly virtuous white men. And they bequeathed us sacred scripture, the Declaration and the Constitution. And that's what we have in common. Now, if you look at those two documents, what you see is what I took, again, the contradiction. What is it that holds a state together? Well, order. What is it that makes the state reformable, open to change, the possibility of revolution? Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary document. And it makes a radical assertion about human equality and about government by consent of the government. It's truly radical. Constitution makes no reference to any of those things. It doesn't talk about the right of revolution. What it talks about is the government is entitled to put down an insurrection. And between those two texts, between those two poles, that's the tension within our political society, between rebellion, reform, break it up, start over, preserve it, order, structure.
So how does that myth specifically, kind of as you spoke to the contradiction, how does it come to terms with those two things that seem to be antithetical to each other in some ways, with, again, the Declaration of Independence being inherently revolutionary, and then the Constitution being kind of what started the new establishment that, like, the revolution was against at first?
There's no way to work this out. And to show you just how crazy the it can be, the modern, most significant to me, modern use of the myth of the founding. And what they're saying is that the Declaration of Independence gives you the moral right to rebel. But the Second Amendment, according to this version of the myth of the founding, the Second Amendment gives you a constitutional right to arm yourself to resist a tyrannical government. And that's what's being invoked by those groups. So you're invoking the Constitution against the Constitution. It's an exotic notion. It's what's called in law the Palladium Doctrine. It was stated by a Supreme Court Justice, Joseph Story, in 1833, that the Second Amendment is the palladium of our liberties because it is the right that protects all other rights. And now there you have it. That's the contradiction in a nutshell. The rebellion protected by, supposedly protected by the Constitution. The antithesis of that is Abraham Lincoln's doctrine, which is that when an election has been fairly decided by ballots, there can be no resort to bullets.
Sounds like Constitution Inception or something, using the Constitution to go at.
That's right. That's right. That's why I say that the thing to watch for in myth is, yeah, you can absolutely use myth for straight up propaganda to support a government program. You can absolutely do that, but the language is tricky. There are contradictions within it that open it up to, in my view, gun rights, a gross misuse of the tradition, but it also is a way of thinking about reform.
Yep. So the next myth is the myth of the Civil War, which I feel like with this one, there's still new ones coming out to this day. And I mean, there's too many of them to count, it seems, really. Can you go into the core of this myth and maybe why it seems like there's so many still being cycled about it as well?
Okay, there's three different versions, but I'll stick with two really important ones. One is what I call the liberation myth. Abraham Lincoln is the key figure here, that the war for the Union saved government of the people, by the people, for the people. And it also reached out to include formerly enslaved Black people in that all men created equal notion. And that's the origin of, in a sense, the liberal myth. The counter to that is what I call the lost cause. This is the South's version, and it says that the Southern way of life of an orthodox kind was the essence of what civilization is and ought to be. That the South was right to defend it by seceding in 1860. They lost the war, but after the war, they resisted Reconstruction in the name of restoring white supremacy, white patriarchy, and a Christian conservative society. And that they were entitled in both instances to use violence, extraordinary violence, in order to achieve those ends. The violence of secession and civil war, the violence of lynching, so-called race riots, which are really pogroms or racial massacres, and the establishment of one-party government in the South, which is another aspect of it. And those are really the two. Now, because race is at the core of both of those stories, we keep coming back to them because as Americans, we have not resolved the conundrum of how do you form a unified society out of a multiracial, multi-ethnic population? How do you form a single unit out of that? The anti-Black elements of the lost cause have also an anti-immigrant component to them, traditionally speaking, and an opposition particularly to certain ethnic immigrant groups as well. And the reason that's the reason that keep coming back to it is we keep not solving America's race problem. And when it comes to the fore, those stories come to the fore. In our time, it was really big in the 60s. If you think of Martin Luther King in front of the Lincoln Memorial, there's your Civil War imagery right there. And if you look at the photographs of the video of the demonstrators being mobbed by the police in Birmingham and Selma, you see plenty of Confederate flags. And you know what that's about. It's the Civil War. But it's come back with MAGA and with this notion that MAGA is defending a white Christian America against a non-white immigrant, non-Anglo, and culturally liberal, just to put it that way, culturally liberated America, religious heresy, and various other things. So it's old stuff, but it's come back because the disorder is with us right now.
And that's good you mentioned it coming back, because my next question was gonna be as to what was the utility of this myth, whether it be the liberation or the lost cause front, because like, what is the purpose of when people discuss this, like the circles that exist in? I'm sure we saw it, as you said, like during the civil rights movement. I think now the parallels would be with like the MAGA movement trying to push back on immigrants. So
Right.
what is kind of the utility of using this myth?
Okay, look at to find the utility, look at what the story of the myth centers on. We're talking frontier myth, we're talking Indian fighter, right? So we're talking a form that violence is going to be part of that. If we're talking about the lost cause, we're talking about the legitimation of physical violence, political violence, to achieve the end, and of things that are analogous to violence, like refusing to let your political opponents vote and forming a one-party government. It's an action script. And the action that you're licensing involves violence. Why does the gun rights movement figure in this? There's nothing inherently racial about the assertion that we should have a right to self-defense as broad as possible. In fact, there's a long tradition of Black gun rights movements and self-defense organizations in the South for obvious reasons. I'm thinking particularly of a story that Condoleezza Rice tells about her father in Lowndes County, Alabama, explaining why she is a Second Amendment absolutist, as in her, to quote her. But the reason why gun rights is allied to the lost cause in this MAGA movement is to license you to use your firearms, to bring the guns with you, to at least menace with them, and actually to use them, as happened on January 6th.
As did indeed. I do have a couple questions I want to ask you about the four myths, I guess, altogether, or just national myths in general. But I do, because you touched on the myth of the good war at the beginning.
Yes.
Was there anything else that you would have to say to that if you wanted to expand?
Yeah, just one thing is that it links, it's a myth that links the idea of a racially and ethnically diverse society, is that you seem to have to bring war along with it. And that's not necessarily something you want to say is inevitable. That the only reason Black and white can live together is because there's somebody out there, what's that, the Romulans or something, who are more alien to us than either race is to the other. That's the problematic with the good war myth. On the other hand, if you do look at the rhetoric of somebody like Barack Obama, he invokes it a lot in talking about, this society has prospered, has defended itself, and become strong by being united in its diversity. So the two things are very close together. It's particularly problematic for the left right now because there is no good war on the horizon, with the possible exception of Ukraine. But we also understand from the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and Israel and Gaza that when you buy into a war, you buy the whole thing.
Yeah.
You don't just buy the part of it that you would, in your best moments, approve of. And so that's why I think it's become difficult for the left to use that myth. What the left has needed is to transform what I call in the book the myth of the civil rights movement, the myth of the movement, so that it's not the myth of several different movements for different identity groups, but it is a movement that is national, and it produces a certain kind of nationality that nobody has known before. That's surprisingly, it's an easy story to describe. It turns out it's not so easy to tell using the materials of American history.
So I guess zooming out from specifically talking about just these four and just national myths in general, what are some of the effects that can be seen from people when they do abuse these myths? I know offhand, like some of the ones you mentioned, like you could abuse the good war myth to get us into pointless conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Could you lay out some of the wider dangers that could be we could be exposed to from people utilizing these myths for whether it be propaganda or whatever it might be?
Well, the most dangerous one, I think, is the lost cause myth, because it really has become central to the MAGA campaign towards Project 2025. And it involves a true reconstruction, but a systematic program for, first of all, identifying non-whites as racial others and aliens. Second, excluding them from the means of achieving political power. Applying the same to women. And establishing ultimately a one-party Christian government, which is exactly what they're talking about. If you read their documents and also the platform of the National Conservative movement, which is very closely connected with this, and the point is that we're in such, as Trump keeps saying, we're such a mess as a country. We're so corrupted. Our bloodstream is full of vermin and things that are corrupting it. Well, what do? You purge, you deport, you exclude, you exterminate. While nobody's talking about extermination in a literal sense, the thrust is to eliminate the poisonous peoples from the body politic. And that is the lost cause myth. That is the essence of the lost cause myth. And that, to me, that is the most important one that is currently playing on your local screen.
So I had one last question I want to ask you,
Sure.
and I think you've already done a pretty wonderful job of talking about it throughout the interview, but could you kind of further go into the role that these myths have played in shaping some of America, whether it be culturally or how these things are looked at? Because I know, especially when I was younger, but even now, despite, I guess, more diversity measures being attempted in our society, a lot of things in our culture are still very white-centered. And I've noticed a lot of these myths tend to be white-centered as well, at least the big four that we spoke about. And I'm sure that can kind of be extrapolated to other communities as well, whether it's like very straight-centered, man-centered, American-centered, to leave out immigrants. So I'm curious if you could just kind of go further into the effects that these myths had on forming that kind of cultural anxiety about trying to remain this way, whether it be fear of whites being in the majority or the stigma around brown people, like the rumors we see in Springfield, like this kind of thing.
Yeah. The notion of racial exclusion is built into two of the four, as and I guess it's implicit in the myth of the founding. It's there in the frontier. It's there in the lost cause. But the first myth that broke with that whiteness thing is the good war myth. To a certain extent, the liberation myth, but the liberation myth is white people liberating black people. So it's still a story centered on whites, and the good war is different. It really tells the story in a different kind of way. You can say that whites may predominate within it, but it's a different concept of the whole, different concept of the group. So there's a kind of proportionality there that gives you a sense. If this is our history, then 3/4 of our history is white and 1/4 is diverse, and that's pretty close to real if you think about it. If you think that Jim Crow didn't legally end, forget about de facto for a minute, didn't legally end until 1970.
Mhm.
So what, 55 years? I mean, the first time I went with my family, drove down south to visit relatives in Florida. I went through the Jim Crow South, and it was scary. And it's within a lifetime that we're still there. That's critical thing that I think is part of the myth. Only thing I can say is that there are these countervailing elements within it that permit you to identify with the other side and to bring it forward. And if that's done, when that's done, things change. If it isn't done, things don't change. The myth it's a complex vocabulary, can be used by various people in various ways. It's emotionally powerful, which is why I want the left to use it. But I don't deny that it is extremely hard given the materials we have to work with.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you again for sharing some of your knowledge on the myths with us. If anybody wants to learn more about the myths, remember the book is A Great Disorder, National Myth, and the Battle for America. I appreciate you so much sharing your
Thank you.
knowledge and teaching me about a lot, you know.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.